The excuse came at 5:47 hours, delivered in a voice so steady it could have been reading weather reports. Unable to comply with formation flight, sir. Medical restriction. The words crackled through the radio static of Kandahar airfield, cutting through the pre-dawn briefing chatter like a blade through silk. Colonel Marcus Hendricks nearly choked on his coffee, the steaming liquid burning his throat as laughter erupted from the operations tent. Around him, a dozen pilots exchanged knowing glances, the kind reserved for fresh meat trying to dodge their first real mission. Medical restriction, Hendricks repeated, his voice dripping with the particular brand of disdain reserved for what he assumed was a rookie's cold feet. The morning sun hadn't yet painted the Hindu Kush mountains gold, but the heat was already building in the cramped briefing tent, mixing sweat with anticipation and diesel fumes from the generators humming outside. Captain Reina Vasquez, you're flying a single-seat F-16 Fighting Falcon, not requesting sick leave from desk duty. The radio stayed silent for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for Hendricks to mentally compose his next verbal assault. When Vasquez's voice returned, it carried the same mechanical precision, devoid of emotion or justification. Roger that, sir. Standing by for alternative assignment. What Hendricks couldn't see from his air-conditioned command post was Captain Vasquez standing beside her aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness, her flight suit unzipped to the waist despite regulations, revealing a white tank top beneath. What he couldn't see were the raised ridges of scar tissue that began at her left shoulder blade and spiderwebbed across her back like a roadmap of hell. 18 separate entry wounds, from an IED explosion that had claimed her previous aircraft and nearly her life 6 months earlier. What he couldn't see was the way her hands trembled slightly as she pressed them against the cool metal of her F-16's fuselage, fighting the phantom sensation of fire that still visited her in quiet moments. The other pilots had stopped laughing. Something in Vasquez's tone suggested this wasn't typical pre-mission jitters. Major Tommy Briggs, call sign Throttle, had flown with Vasquez before, back when she'd been known as Phoenix for her uncanny ability to pull miraculous recoveries from impossible situations. He'd seen her thread the needle between mountain peaks in zero visibility, watched her talk a rookie pilot through hydraulic failure over hostile territory, using nothing but calm encouragement and flawless technical knowledge. But that was before Peshawar province, before the mission that had left her aircraft a twisted metal sculpture in the Afghan desert and her back looking like she'd been used for shrapnel practice. Now she was just another pilot with restrictions, another warrior whose body had written checks her spirit couldn't cash. The morning air shimmered with heat waves rising from the tarmac, distorting the line of aircraft like a mirage. In the distance, the mountains stood silent and impassive, holding their secrets close. Today, they would witness either redemption or ruin. The only question was which ghost would claim victory, the pilot Phoenix had been, or the woman Captain Vasquez was trying to become. Dawn broke across Kandahar airfield like spilled paint on canvas, washing the concrete and aircraft in shades of amber and rose. The morning briefing had devolved into what seasoned pilots called administrative bullshit, paperwork warfare disguised as operational necessity. Hendricks was still chuckling about Vasquez's medical restriction when the tent flap burst open, admitting a blast of superheated air and Major Briggs. "Sir, we need to talk." Briggs's voice carried the weight of a man who'd seen too much and said too little. His flight suit was already dark with sweat stains despite the early hour, and his usually easy demeanor had hardened into something resembling granite. About Vasquez. Hendricks waved dismissively, his attention still focused on the mission planning board where red pushpins marked enemy positions like a disease spreading across the map of Helmand Province. "What's to discuss? She's got cold feet, Briggs. Happens to the best of them eventually. Hell, I've seen hotshot pilots crack under pressure before." "She's not cracking." The interruption came sharp and clean, cutting through Hendricks's assumptions like a scalpel through infected tissue. Briggs stepped closer to the planning table, his shadow falling across the tactical maps. Phoenix doesn't crack, sir. She bends, she adapts, but she doesn't crack. The use of Vasquez's call sign, Phoenix, caused a ripple of silence through the tent. Call signs weren't just nicknames in the pilot community. They were earned through blood, sweat, and moments that defined careers. Phoenix suggested resurrection, rebirth from ashes, survival against impossible odds. It wasn't the kind of call sign given lightly or worn by someone prone to making excuses. Phoenix, Hendricks raised an eyebrow, his coffee suddenly tasting more bitter than usual. I thought her call sign was. He paused, realizing he'd never actually asked. In his mind, she'd simply been the new girl, another pilot rotation to be processed, evaluated, and ultimately dismissed or endorsed based on performance metrics. Phoenix, Briggs confirmed, settling into one of the folding chairs with the weary grace of someone carrying invisible weight. Earned it 3 years ago over Syria. Engine failure at 15,000 feet, complete hydraulic loss, no ejection seat, the whole 9 yards of nightmare scenarios. She dead-sticked a $40 million aircraft into a landing strip that was basically a glorified dirt road. Saved the airframe, saved the mission, saved her own ass without breaking a sweat. Outside the tent, the morning's first wave of aircraft began their pre-flight checks. The whine of turbine engines spooling up mixed with the metallic clanking of ordnance being loaded, creating a symphony of controlled violence that was both familiar and oddly comforting. This was the sound of American air power preparing to project force across hostile territory, the mechanical heartbeat of warriors getting ready to dance with death. Hendricks found himself studying the tactical board with new interest, his assumptions beginning to shift like sand dunes in desert wind. If Vasquez, Phoenix, was truly a pilot of exceptional skill, then her medical restriction wasn't cowardice. It was something else entirely, something that might actually matter in ways he hadn't considered. The radio crackled with tower communications, pilots checking in for taxi clearance and final weather updates. Somewhere in that electronic chatter was Phoenix, standing by her aircraft, dealing with demons that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with the brutal mathematics of survival. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away shadows and illuminating truths that bureaucratic efficiency had kept hidden. Briggs lit a cigarette with steady hands, exhaling smoke that danced in the tent's artificial lighting. His eyes held the particular 1,000-yard stare that came from watching good pilots die for bad reasons, from seeing politics override common sense, from knowing that sometimes the most dangerous enemy was incompetence wearing colonel's eagles. "Tell me about Peshawar province," Hendricks said quietly, his voice losing its earlier swagger. The request hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implications neither man wanted to explore but both knew they couldn't avoid. The story came in pieces, like shrapnel being carefully extracted from a wound. Major Briggs spoke in the clinical tone pilots used when discussing the undiscussable, missions that went sideways, decisions that haunted sleep, moments when training collided with reality and left survivors picking up fragments of what used to make sense. March 15th. Close air support mission for a Special Forces team pinned down near the Pakistani border. Briggs's cigarette burned forgotten between his fingers, ash accumulating like snow on his flight suit. Phoenix was flying lead in a 2-ship formation, call sign Venom Flight. The ground team was taking heavy fire from a compound that intelligence had marked as abandoned. Hendricks felt his coffee growing cold in his hands, but couldn't bring himself to drink. Outside the tent, the morning flight operations continued their familiar rhythm, pilots walking to aircraft, crew chiefs performing final inspections, the controlled chaos of military aviation preparing for another day of delivering democracy at supersonic speeds. Target acquisition was clean, Briggs continued, his voice steady despite the weight of memory pressing against his words. Phoenix made her first pass, dropped precision ordnance right on target. Secondary explosions confirmed ammunition storage. Mission should have been textbook, in and out, good guys safe, bad guys neutralized. The pause stretched like wire under tension. In the silence, Hendricks could hear the distant sound of F-16s taxiing, their engines creating a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. These were the sounds of routine, of another day in a war that had become as familiar as morning coffee and afternoon heat. But intelligence was wrong, Hendricks said, already knowing where the story was heading but needing to hear it confirmed. Intelligence was catastrophically fucking wrong. The profanity carried no heat, just the flat acknowledgement of a truth too bitter for polite language. The compound wasn't abandoned. It was a makeshift school. 43 children between the ages of 6 and 14, plus 2 teachers who'd been trying to provide education in a war zone. The words hit like physical blows, each syllable carrying the weight of lives ended by miscalculation and faulty information. This was the nightmare scenario every pilot feared, the moment when following orders perfectly led to consequences that would echo through nightmares for decades. Briggs stubbed out his cigarette with mechanical precision, his movements controlled in the way that suggested barely contained emotion. Phoenix was already climbing out when the second explosion hit, cooking off buried ordnance that intelligence had missed. The blast wave caught her at 300 feet, flipped her aircraft inverted, shredded her tail section with debris. Hendricks could visualize the scenario unfolding like a slow-motion disaster movie. An F-16 Fighting Falcon, sleek and deadly, transformed in an instant from predator to victim. Metal and flesh subjected to forces that aircraft weren't designed to withstand. Pilot and machine locked together in a dance with physics that rarely ended well. She should have ejected, Briggs said, his voice barely above a whisper. Any rational pilot would have pulled the handle and taken their chances with a parachute landing in hostile territory. But Phoenix, he shook his head, a gesture that encompassed admiration, disbelief, and something approaching awe. The morning sun had climbed high enough to begin its assault on the tense canvas walls, turning the interior into an oven that would soon become unbearable. But neither man seemed to notice the building heat, both caught in the gravity well of a story that explained everything about why Captain Reina Vasquez might legitimately claim medical restrictions. The rest of the story unfolded like a masterclass in aviation emergency procedures written in blood and determination. Phoenix had fought her damaged aircraft through a dead-stick landing that should have been impossible, nursing a machine that was more scrap metal than airplane through 5 minutes of controlled flight that defied both physics and common sense. She put it down in a riverbed 12 miles from the original target, Briggs said, his voice carrying the particular reverence pilots reserved for discussing the impossible made manifest. Wheels up landing on terrain that would challenge a helicopter pilot. Zero forward visibility, hydraulics completely shot, flight controls responding like suggestions rather than commands. The landing had been survivable, barely. The explosion that followed, a delayed detonation of remaining ordnance triggered by the impact, had been something else entirely. Phoenix had managed to exit the aircraft and run approximately 30 meters before the blast wave caught her, driving fragments of her own airplane into her back like high-velocity needles. Hendricks found himself staring at the tactical planning board without seeing it, his mind constructing images of a pilot crawling away from burning wreckage, while fragments of metal worked their way deeper into tissue that hadn't been designed to accommodate foreign objects. The clinical part of his brain cataloged this as survivable trauma, while the human part wondered how someone continued functioning after experiencing hell firsthand. 18 pieces of shrapnel, Briggs continued, his voice now clinical in the way that military medical reports were clinical, precise, detailed, and completely inadequate for describing human suffering. Ranging from fragments the size of rice grains to a piece of turbine blade that came within 2 millimeters of severing her spinal column. Surgery took 11 hours. Recovery took 3 months. Return to flight status. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Return to flight status was never really the question, Hendricks said quietly, understanding beginning to dawn like unwelcome sunrise. The question was whether she could psychologically handle close formation flying with other aircraft when her last experience involved her own airplane trying to kill her. The tent fell silent except for the omnipresent hum of generators and the distant sounds of flight operations. Outside their climate-controlled bubble, the war continued its relentless progression. Missions planned, ordnance loaded, pilots preparing to risk their lives based on intelligence that might be wrong, orders that might be flawed, and assumptions that might prove fatal. Briggs nodded slowly, his expression carrying the weight of someone who understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to function effectively despite fear. Formation flying requires absolute trust in your wingman's predictability. When your brain has been rewired by trauma to expect aircraft to explode without warning, that trust becomes, he searched for the right word, complicated. The radio crackled with routine communications, tower clearing aircraft for departure, pilots acknowledging taxi instructions, the mechanical poetry of aviation bureaucracy. Somewhere in that electronic chatter, Phoenix was dealing with demons that had nothing to do with cowardice and everything to do with the brutal honesty of post-traumatic stress. The mission briefing had to continue despite the weight of revelation settling over the operations tent like humidity before a storm. 24 aircraft were scheduled for departure within the next 2 hours, their collective firepower representing millions of dollars in ordnance, and the hopes of ground forces who needed close air support to survive another day in hostile territory. Hendricks studied the tactical board with new eyes, seeing beyond the red pushpins marking enemy positions to the complex web of human decisions that would determine whether those positions were eliminated or merely relocated. Each aircraft represented a pilot with their own history, their own accumulated trauma, their own relationship with the thin line between courage and catastrophe. "What's her current flight status?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. The question carried implications that extended beyond administrative curiosity. If Phoenix was genuinely compromised by psychological trauma, assigning her to combat missions could endanger both her and any pilot unlucky enough to be assigned as her wingman. Briggs consulted a manila folder that had appeared from somewhere in his flight suit's numerous pockets. The gesture was practiced, suggesting he'd anticipated this conversation and come prepared with documentation. Cleared for single-ship operations, restricted from formation flying, no limitations on combat sorties or air-to-ground operations. Essentially, she can kill the enemy but can't play well with others. The irony wasn't lost on Hendricks. The military's most social activity, aviation, had been reduced to a solitary pursuit for one of their most skilled practitioners. Phoenix could deliver precision ordnance with surgical accuracy, could thread the needle through defensive systems that would challenge the most experienced pilots, could accomplish missions that required both technical expertise and nerve-deadening courage. She just couldn't do it while maintaining close proximity to other aircraft. How long has she been operating under these restrictions? The question emerged before Hendricks could consider whether he really wanted to know the answer. Administrative efficiency demanded that pilots either perform without limitations or be medically retired. The existence of someone operating in the gray zone between full capability and medical discharge suggested bureaucratic complexity that made his head hurt. 6 months, Briggs replied, his tone suggesting this was both longer than typical and shorter than ideal. The Air Force has been flexible regarding her situation. Phoenix's combat record speaks for itself. 17 successful missions since returning to flight status, 0 incidents, 0 complaints from ground forces requesting support. The numbers told a story that transcended simple arithmetic. 17 missions represented 17 opportunities for enemy forces to eliminate a high-value target, 17 chances for equipment failure or pilot error to transform routine operations into tragedy, 17 occasions when someone's life depended on Phoenix's ability to deliver violence with precision despite whatever demons were riding in her cockpit. "And today's mission?" Hendricks asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The tactical board showed a complex operation requiring multiple aircraft working in close coordination, exactly the kind of assignment that would test Phoenix's restrictions while potentially putting other pilots at risk. Briggs's smile held no humor, just the weary acknowledgement that military operations rarely accommodated individual limitations, regardless of how legitimate those limitations might be. Close air support for a Marine reconnaissance team that's been pinned down for 18 hours. Enemy forces are using the cover of a village, civilian casualties are a primary concern, and the target area requires precision ordnance delivered from multiple angles simultaneously. The mission parameters painted a picture of complexity that would challenge even a full-strength formation of experienced pilots working in perfect coordination. Attempting it with a key participant who couldn't fly in close formation was like trying to perform surgery while wearing mittens, theoretically possible but practically insane. Outside the tent, the morning sun continued its relentless climb toward noon, transforming the Afghan landscape into a furnace that would soon make ground operations nearly unbearable. Time was becoming a weapon wielded by both geography and enemy forces, each passing hour reducing the Marines' chances of survival, while increasing the likelihood that any rescue attempt would encounter expanded resistance. The radio crackled with an incoming transmission, the familiar voice cutting through static and electronic interference like a blade through fog. "Kandahar Tower, Phoenix 01 requesting permission to taxi for single-ship departure." The words carried no emotion, no indication of the psychological burden their speaker carried, just professional competence wrapped in standard phraseology. Hendricks reached for his microphone, then hesitated. The next words he spoke would either send Phoenix into combat alone, a violation of every tactical doctrine the Air Force had developed through decades of learning experiences written in blood, or ground her despite the Marines who needed her support. Both choices carried consequences that would echo through official reports and personal nightmares. "Phoenix 01, stand by," he transmitted, his voice carefully modulated to reveal nothing of the decision-making process occurring in the operations tent. 3 words that bought time he didn't have to make choices between bad options and worse alternatives. Briggs was watching him with the particular intensity pilots reserved for moments when lives hung in the balance of administrative decisions. Outside the tent, the sounds of routine flight operations continued, but inside their climate-controlled bubble, the weight of command was transforming theoretical authority into practical responsibility. The decision, when it came, emerged from the intersection of military necessity and human understanding. Hendricks keyed his microphone, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to authorize. "Phoenix 01, cleared to taxi runway 27. You'll be flying single-ship close air support, coordinates to follow." The response came immediately, as if Phoenix had been waiting for exactly this authorization. "Roger, Kandahar Tower, Phoenix 01 taxiing runway 27 for single-ship departure." Her voice carried the same professional neutrality it had maintained throughout the morning, but something underneath suggested relief, the particular gratitude of a warrior being allowed to participate in the fight despite carrying invisible wounds. Briggs nodded approvingly, his expression suggesting that Hendricks had just passed some sort of test he hadn't realized he was taking. "She'll get the Marines out," he said with quiet confidence. "Phoenix always gets the job done, even when the job seems impossible." Through the tent's observation window, they could see the distinctive silhouette of an F-16 Fighting Falcon beginning its taxi toward the active runway. At this distance, the aircraft looked like a toy, a sleek model that had been scaled up and weaponized for the adult business of delivering democracy at supersonic speeds. But appearances were deceptive. That particular airframe carried pilot and ordnance worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime, wrapped in technology that represented humanity's most sophisticated attempt to dominate the aerial battlefield. The morning sun reflected off the F-16's canopy, turning the cockpit into a mirror that concealed its occupant while revealing the sky that would soon become her office. Somewhere behind that reflective surface, Captain Reina Phoenix Vasquez was running through pre-flight checklists that had become as automatic as breathing, her hands moving across controls with the muscle memory of hundreds of previous sorties. "What happens after today?" Hendricks asked, though he suspected the question had no clean answer. The military's administrative machinery demanded binary decisions: fit for duty or medically retired, mission capable or liability, asset or problem. Phoenix's situation seemed to exist in the spaces between those categories, a reminder that human complexity rarely fit neatly into bureaucratic frameworks. Briggs shrugged, the gesture encompassing both uncertainty and acceptance. "That depends on how today goes. If she performs flawlessly, the restrictions probably continue until someone decides they're no longer necessary. If there's any indication that her limitations are affecting mission effectiveness." He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. The radio provided a merciful interruption, Phoenix's voice cutting through their speculation with the practical immediacy of aviation reality. "Kandahar Tower, Phoenix 01 ready for departure, requesting vectors to target area." Her tone suggested that philosophical discussions about her future were less important than the immediate task of providing fire support to Marines who needed her help more than they needed her to be psychologically whole. Hendricks consulted his tactical display, noting the coordinates that had been uploaded from the reconnaissance team's forward observer. The numbers represented a location in the mountains where American forces were surrounded by enemy combatants using civilians as cover, a tactical nightmare that required precision, patience, and the particular kind of controlled aggression that separated professional pilots from enthusiastic amateurs. "Phoenix 01 cleared for takeoff. Target coordinates uploaded to your navigation system. Ground frequency will be Tombstone 24. Marines are designated Raven 6. He paused, considering whether to add something personal to the transmission, then decided that professionalism served everyone better than sentiment. "Good hunting, Phoenix." The acknowledgement came crisp and immediate. "Roger, cleared for takeoff. Phoenix 01 rolling." Through the observation window, they watched the F-16 begin its takeoff roll, engines building thrust until the aircraft seemed to strain against invisible leashes holding it to the earth. Then momentum overcame gravity, and Phoenix lifted off into the Afghan sky, banking southeast toward mountains that held both enemies and allies in roughly equal measure. The aircraft climbed rapidly, its silver fuselage disappearing into the morning haze until only contrails marked its passage. Somewhere in that cockpit, a pilot with 18 pieces of shrapnel worked into her back was flying alone toward a confrontation that would test both her technical skills and her psychological resilience. Briggs lit another cigarette, his movements deliberate and unhurried despite the tension that filled the operations tent like smoke. "Now we wait," he said, exhaling through words that acknowledged the particular helplessness of command. The moment when decisions had been made, and all that remained was discovering whether those decisions had been correct. The radio chatter continued its familiar rhythm, but now every transmission carried additional weight. Somewhere in the electronic maze of military communications, Phoenix was coordinating with Marines who needed her help, navigating both physical obstacles and personal demons while flying a $40 million aircraft through hostile airspace. The mountains of Afghanistan stretched toward Pakistan like sleeping giants, their peaks catching the morning sun and holding it like captured fire. Below those peaks, among valleys that had witnessed centuries of conflict, a reconnaissance team was learning whether their survival would depend on the marksmanship skills of a pilot carrying invisible wounds. Hendricks found himself studying the tactical board with new intensity, as if staring at the red pushpins might provide insight into the complex equation of violence and precision that Phoenix was attempting to solve. Each symbol represented enemy positions, civilian locations, geographical obstacles, variables in a problem that had no perfect solution, only degrees of acceptable failure. The first transmission from the target area came 37 minutes after Phoenix's departure, crackling through atmospheric interference and electronic jamming, with the particular clarity that emerged from situations where communication meant survival. Tombstone 24, Phoenix 01 on station, requesting target identification from Raven 6. The response came immediately, delivered in the clipped tones of someone who had been waiting for help long enough to appreciate its arrival. Phoenix 01, Raven 6. We've got approximately 40 enemy combatants using a village as cover. Civilians are confirmed present. Repeat. Civilians are confirmed present. We need precision fires on military targets only. Through the radio, Hendricks could hear the sound of small arms fire in the background of the transmission, automatic weapons creating a deadly percussion that provided urgent soundtrack to the tactical problem Phoenix was being asked to solve. Somewhere in those mountains, Marines were taking fire from enemy positions that couldn't be eliminated without risking civilian casualties. Raven 6, Phoenix 01. I have visual on your position, marking targets with laser designation. Confirm you can identify civilian structures. Phoenix's voice carried the particular calm that came from professional competence applied to extreme circumstances. She was flying alone above a hostile valley, but her tone suggested she might have been conducting a training exercise rather than a life-or-death mission. The tactical challenge was becoming clear through the radio exchanges. Enemy forces had positioned themselves among civilian structures, using noncombatants as human shields, while maintaining fields of fire that kept the Marine reconnaissance team pinned down. Any air support would need to distinguish between military targets and innocent civilians while delivering ordnance with surgical precision. Phoenix 01, Raven 6 confirms civilian structures identified. We're showing approximately 20 buildings in the village, estimate 60 to 80 noncombatants still present. Enemy positions are marked with smoke. The forward observer's voice carried the weight of someone whose survival depended on Phoenix's ability to kill selectively. Through the operations tent speakers, they could hear the background noise of Phoenix's cockpit, the steady hum of electronics, the whisper of air conditioning systems, the subtle vibrations that indicated an aircraft operating at the edge of controlled violence. These were the sounds of American air power being brought to bear on a problem that required both overwhelming force and restraining precision. Briggs crushed his cigarette with mechanical efficiency, his attention focused entirely on the radio communications that would determine whether his assessment of Phoenix's capabilities had been correct. In the space of the next few minutes, they would learn whether psychological trauma could coexist with professional excellence, or whether invisible wounds inevitably compromised operational effectiveness. Raven 6, Phoenix 01. I'm seeing the smoke markers. Confirm you need fires on the two-story structure at grid reference. Phoenix's voice trailed off as she presumably consulted her targeting systems, reading coordinates that would either save Marine lives or add civilian casualties to her already substantial burden of guilt. The mathematical precision of aerial warfare was about to collide with the brutal chaos of ground combat, mediated by a pilot whose back carried permanent reminders of the last time she trusted intelligence and followed orders without question. In the operations tent, two officers waited to discover whether redemption was possible or whether some wounds never truly healed. The target coordination continued with the mechanical precision that characterized professional military communications, each exchange of information bringing Phoenix closer to the moment when she would either save lives or add to the casualty count that haunted her dreams. Through the radio, Hendricks could hear the subtle changes in her voice, fractional increases in tension that suggested the weight of decision-making was affecting her despite her professional composure. Raven 6, Phoenix 01 has multiple targets identified. I'm seeing enemy positions in 3 separate structures, with clear fields of fire to civilian buildings. Recommend sequential engagement beginning with target designation Alpha. Her voice carried the particular authority that came from understanding both the technical requirements of precision ordnance delivery and the human consequences of accuracy failure. The response from the ground came layered with static and the ongoing percussion of small arms fire. Phoenix 01, Raven 6 concurs. Engage target Alpha on your discretion. Be advised we're taking increasing fire from that position. The forward observer's words were punctuated by the distinctive crack of bullets passing close enough to interfere with radio transmission. In the operations tent, Briggs was monitoring multiple communication frequencies simultaneously, his expression suggesting that he was tracking details beyond what Hendricks could perceive. The tactical situation was becoming more complex as enemy forces realized that American air support was imminent. They would either disperse to avoid destruction or intensify their attacks before that destruction arrived. Raven 6, Phoenix 01 is rolling in hot. Estimate 30 seconds to target engagement. Phoenix's transmission carried a subtle change in tone, the shift from coordination to execution that marked the transition from planning violence to delivering it. Somewhere above the Afghan mountains, a pilot with 18 pieces of shrapnel in her back was lining up a shot that would either demonstrate her continued competence or reveal the limitations that trauma had imposed. The silence that followed was filled with tension so thick it seemed to have physical weight. Hendricks found himself holding his breath despite the rational understanding that his respiratory status had no effect on events occurring hundreds of miles away. This was the moment when theoretical discussions about Phoenix's capabilities would be tested against the unforgiving reality of combat operations. The explosion, when it came, arrived as sound transmitted through radio communications, a deep, resonant boom that suggested high explosives detonating with the particular violence that characterized precision-guided munitions. Phoenix had delivered her ordnance, and now all that remained was discovering whether her targeting had been accurate enough to eliminate enemy positions without harming civilians. Direct hit on target Alpha, came the confirmation from Raven 6, his voice carrying relief that was audible even through electronic interference. Secondary explosions indicate ammunition storage. Enemy fire from that position has ceased. The words represented more than tactical success. They confirmed that Phoenix retained the ability to deliver violence with surgical precision despite whatever psychological burden she carried. But the mission was far from complete. 2 additional enemy positions required elimination, and each subsequent engagement would test Phoenix's ability to maintain accuracy while operating under increasing stress. The enemy forces would be adjusting their tactics, the civilian population would be seeking shelter, and the Marines would be dealing with the fluid dynamics of a battlefield where air support was transforming the tactical equation. Phoenix 01, Raven 6, targets Bravo and Charlie are adjusting positions. Request immediate engagement before they can establish new firing positions. The urgency in the ground controller's voice suggested that the tactical advantage gained from eliminating the first target would be temporary, unless Phoenix could maintain the pressure on remaining enemy forces. The second engagement followed with mechanical precision, Phoenix's voice maintaining the same professional composure as she coordinated target identification and ordnance delivery. But Hendricks was beginning to detect subtle changes, microscopic hesitations that suggested the stress of solo combat operations was accumulating despite her technical competence. Rolling in on target Bravo, civilian structure approximately 15 meters southeast of target, confirm acceptable blast radius. Phoenix's request for confirmation revealed the particular burden of a pilot whose previous experience with civilian casualties had left permanent psychological scars. She was seeking additional authorization for what should have been a routine tactical decision. The hesitation lasted only seconds, but in combat operations, seconds could determine the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Raven 6's response came immediately. Confirmed acceptable blast radius. Civilians have been observed evacuating to the north. You are cleared hot. The second explosion followed the first by approximately 3 minutes, creating another deep boom that resonated through radio communications and presumably through the mountain valleys where Phoenix was operating. Again, the result was immediate cessation of enemy fire from the targeted position, confirming that her precision remained unimpaired by psychological stress. But Hendricks was beginning to understand that Phoenix's medical restrictions weren't about her ability to fly or fight. They were about her ability to trust. Formation flying required absolute confidence in your wingman's predictability, while solo operations allowed for the kind of deliberate, methodical approach that could compensate for trauma-induced hesitation. The final target presented the greatest challenge, requiring Phoenix to deliver ordnance within 20 meters of a confirmed civilian structure, while enemy forces were actively engaging the Marine reconnaissance team. The tactical problem demanded both technical expertise and nerve-steadying confidence, qualities that Phoenix had demonstrated, but which might be compromised by the accumulated stress of operating alone in hostile airspace. Phoenix 01, Raven 6. Target Charlie is in a fortified position adjacent to civilian structure. We need precision fires, danger close authorization requested. The ground controller's words acknowledged that he was asking Phoenix to deliver ordnance close enough to friendly forces that the margin for error approached zero. The pause that followed stretched longer than previous hesitations, suggesting that Phoenix was conducting additional calculations or battling internal demons that had nothing to do with tactical requirements. In the operations tent, Hendricks found himself mentally rehearsing the words he would use to abort the mission if Phoenix's psychological state began affecting her operational effectiveness. When Phoenix's voice returned, it carried a subtle change in tone, a hardening that suggested personal demons had been confronted and temporarily defeated. Raven 6, Phoenix 01 is cleared hot for danger close engagement. Final attack run commencing in 60 seconds. The words represented more than tactical communication. They were a declaration that Captain Reyna, Phoenix, Vasquez was choosing to trust her training, her equipment, and her ability to deliver violence with precision, despite the 18 pieces of shrapnel that served as permanent reminders of what happened when precision failed. The final engagement would determine whether redemption was possible for a pilot whose previous mission had ended in civilian casualties and personal trauma, or whether some psychological wounds were too deep for professional competence to overcome. The third explosion arrived with finality that resonated beyond simple military effectiveness. Through the radio communications, Hendricks could hear the immediate change in background noise, the cessation of enemy fire that indicated Phoenix's final ordnance delivery had eliminated the last significant threat to the Marine reconnaissance team. What had begun as a desperate situation requiring immediate air support had been resolved through the application of precisely delivered violence by a pilot operating alone against both enemy forces and personal demons. Phoenix 01, Raven 6, all enemy positions neutralized, civilian casualties negative. Outstanding work up there. The ground controller's voice carried relief that transcended simple tactical success. 18 Marines would be going home because someone with 18 pieces of shrapnel in her back had chosen to fly alone into hostile airspace and deliver death with surgical precision. The acknowledgement came with Phoenix's characteristic professional neutrality, but Hendricks thought he detected something underneath, perhaps satisfaction, perhaps relief, perhaps simply the exhaustion that followed intense concentration under extreme stress. Raven 6, Phoenix 01. Mission complete. Departing area for return to base. In the operations tent, Briggs was already reaching for the communication equipment that would coordinate Phoenix's return flight, but his expression suggested that the administrative requirements were secondary to the larger implications of what they had just witnessed. A pilot with severe psychological trauma had successfully completed a complex combat mission while operating under restrictions that would have grounded less capable aviators. "She did it," Briggs said, his voice carrying a mixture of satisfaction and vindication. "Solo engagement of multiple targets in a civilian-heavy environment, danger close fire support, zero collateral damage." He paused, consulting notes he'd been taking during the mission. 17 previous missions, now 18. 0 incidents, 0 complaints, 0 failures. The numbers told a story that transcended simple arithmetic. Phoenix had transformed personal trauma into